The following is brought to you by Mount Irving Bay Resort.
And thank you again for joining us this morning. This is the TV6 News Morning Edition, our broadcast on the morning after the Tobago House of Assembly election. And the result, of course, as we know by now, certainly it seems that from the data that we've gotten, very clear in terms of the numbers of persons. It seems that there's been an increase in terms of voter turnout, but we'll get that information hopefully for the ABC sooner rather than later. Tobagonians have voted, at least the majority of those who voted yesterday, for the Progressive Democratic Patriots, the PDP, in the THA election yesterday. It was clear that the island was not in favor of the People's National Movement's governance structure and wanted a change, and that's certainly reflective of the majority of those who would have voted yesterday. And elections usually how we get a sense of how the majority of the people in any jurisdiction feel about their governance. Now, also as well, up to late last night, the final count was not available from the EBC, but as we had said earlier, and as you would have seen last night, the PNM's Tobago Council's political leader, Tracy Davidson Celestin, was said to be fighting to hold on to her seat, and Marshal Melvin Jack was leading by a mere few votes. The political leader for the PDP, Watson Duke, won his seat by a runaway margin of 2-1, but Farley Augustine, the Chief Secretary Designate, the deputy political leader of the PDP, outperformed his leader according to the data that we saw last night with an almost 4-1 margin of victory, while Dr. Faith B. Israel, the Secretary for Health Designate, achieved a 2-1 margin of victory. Now we'll go now to get the perspective of Martin George, the president of the Tobago Business Chamber. Good morning, Mr. George.
Hi, good morning to you, Jewel, and good morning, Tobago, and good morning, Trinidad.
Thank you for joining us this morning.
Yeah, it's indeed a pleasure.
What is your take on what you saw yesterday? What developed last night also in terms of the results? And what is your sense of what we could be looking towards in terms of Tobago going forward after today?
Well, Jewel, from the time they had the 6-6, if you recall, my comment on it was always, I said, while there has been no clear winner there with the 6-6, there was a clear loser. So from then, the trend was already clear, and it was just demonstrated so emphatically last night that I think, in hindsight, to the PNM, 6-6 never looked so good. They probably wish they could have gone back to that position. And you would recall that Tobagonians were of the view that they ought to have engaged more constructively in some arrangements for power sharing or to work with that 6-6 to get something that is, usable for the people of Tobago.
I actually have asked guests on the shows that we've had here so far whether there was an opportunity was lost in that, what you're talking about, the PNM and the PDP working together at that time in January.
And for sure, the PNM is ruined the day that they did not try to make more of that opportunity, because, the fact of the matter is that you at least then had a chance to engage in participatory governance, whereas now you have absolutely no chance whatsoever, and the writing is clearly on the wall, and they definitely have to do a reset in terms of their thinking, their approach. Clearly they misread the population in Tobago. They misread their own supporters, because you would see from the numbers, clearly you would have had to have people who would have voted for PNM even as recently as January, who would have switched to PDP. So clearly there was some misreading of the feeling and the mood on the ground by the PNM hierarchy. So they have to go back to the drawing board and do a whole lot of homework, to try to understand how to meet and treat with the people of Tobago going forward.
And I think the PNM's leadership last night here in Tobago did say they will be going back, revisiting strategies and so on. But what would that mean?
There's a bigger picture to this, Jewel, because if you look at it traditionally, when you look at the historic patterns, Tobago has always been the trendsetter in terms of change politically. So I think the PNM hierarchy, they were acutely aware of that, which is why you saw they threw so much resources into the fight for this Tobago election.
Almost like a barometer, a sense of the temperature of the body politic of Trinidad and Tobago.
That's right.
That's
the point. That's the point. So therefore, you know, it's, I mean, I guess, fortunate for them that general elections are not due until 2025. Because if general elections were due anytime next year, this would be the worst warning sign, you know, in terms of how the mood of the population may possibly be nationally. So I think there's a whole lot of, you know, thinking that they need to engage in, and, you know, introspection as to how they meet and treat people, because it showed really and truly a party that is hopelessly out of touch with the reality of what is going on in Tobago.
But of course the PNM remains, of course, there's no change in central government.
So
you now have this situation. We've seen it before, the party that is in central government not being the party in charge of the THA.
And I think that's good for Tobago, honestly. I think that's good for Tobago, because when you have the same party in control of central government and also in control of the THA, what you have is you always have this supine genuflection to the party hierarchy and leadership in Trinidad, because you can't offend them because they basically are your bosses. We saw it dramatically displayed here in Tobago, you know, I think more than a year ago, when the then Chief Secretary, I think Mr. Kelvin Charles, you know, in a meeting which was chaired by Dr. Rowley publicly, you know, he dared to stand up and try to voice an opinion. And the effect of Dr. Rowley's response to him was basically, you know, to sit down and shut up. You know, so therefore, clearly they cannot ever, you know, attempt to bat out of their creases in that regard. So when you have a different administration in charge of the THA as opposed to in charge of central government, I think it's always better for Tobago, because there's much greater advocacy for the needs of the average Tobagonian than if you have the same party in central government and in charge of the THA.
But obviously no change in terms of the arrangement, in terms of funding for the THA, that would come from disbursements from the central government by budgetary allocations. Mr. Farley, Augustine, the Chief Secretary designate, has said that he would like to have a cordial relationship with Prime Minister Dr. Keith Rowley. He also said that the election result should send a message to the central government that, in his words, that it cannot just do to Tobagonians what it wants. That's his phrasing. So in that sense, what happens in terms of the THA Tobago and that construct, not only in terms of the two political parties, as it were, you have the PNM central government, PDP in charge of the THA, but also that arrangement in terms of budgetary allocation and that dependence on the central government for funding from the state?
Well, I can't see that changing in any fundamental way, you know, in the short term. But what I've always advocated is that Tobago must try to move itself to a position of financial independence, whereby they do not have to rely every year on this $3 or $4 billion being allocated from central government, where they are generating their own income, earning their own income, and, you know, being able to say, well, hey, listen, this is my rightful share of the pie. I'm not asking you for a favor to hand this to me. So these are things that I'm sure the PDP would want to look at. You know, I think I've heard Mr. Farley Augustine speak very passionately about, you know, Tobago getting its rightful share of the national, you know, income, so to speak. He's spoken about oil and gas revenues and the allocation of the proportion that, you know, would be, I guess, Tobago's rightful share in that regard. So I would think that going forward, these are issues that they are going to be discussing and raising with the central government. But I think that this is now a very good time to make a constructive list of, you know, requests in terms of how we want to see Tobago develop its own financial independence, because central government is going to be very careful how they meet and treat with any requests coming from the THA, because they don't want to further antagonize the public in Tobago by appearing to, if you recall, some years ago, a former prime minister, when he suffered a stinging defeat in Tobago, he, you know, vented his anger on Tobago and visited, the vengeance of Moko on Tobago by, withdrawing so many government services and basically punishing and blacklisting Tobago. That cannot happen in this circumstance because Tobagonians will remember you, and there's a general election coming up in 2025, and they will definitely show you how they feel if it is that that's the reaction from central government. So I think central government has a duty to ensure that they meet and treat with this incoming THA executive in a manner that shows a level of respect and courtesy and consideration for the needs of the average Tobagonian.
And the new THA executive also will be taking office at a time when Tobago's economy in particular has suffered with regard to the COVID pandemic and the response thereof in terms of the state response, but also the pandemic has affected things like global air travel, tourism internationally. We heard from one of our panelists last night that maybe Tobago should focus more on domestic tourism as opposed to the international tourism, but hotels like this obviously would like to see something in terms of improvement, obviously, in the economy and the wider society in Tobago. But how does the new THA deal with that under the present circumstances with rising COVID numbers, not just in Tobago, of course, but in Trinidad and Tobago, but
yes.
The focus is on Tobago today.
Right, yes, of course. Right, so these are some of the challenges that they face, and there's no easy answer to it. There's no easy solution. Even the COVID crisis generally, internationally, you recognize there's no straight line formula or answer that any government or any leadership or administration can say, well, yes, this is the workable formula. It's a rolling target. It's a moving target. You have to basically work it out as you go along. But these are some of the challenges they face. But in terms of the domestic tourism, that could never happen if your beaches remain closed. So, to even talk about that is, wishing for castles in the air if you don't have your beaches open.
That's a central government decision.
That's the point, So, I mean, maybe that's some kind of discussion that needs to be had with the central government in that regard. Maybe you can consider opening them for limited periods. Maybe you say 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. or 6 a.m. to 12
I believe the Prime Minister said that he was considering something
I think
early morning
like
till about midday.
Right.
But then again, he did say that depends on the COVID numbers and so on.
That's right.
So that's something we'll be waiting on, of course.
These are discussions that need to be had, because at the end of the day, you are not going to get the domestic tourism if you don't have beaches open.
Is this an opportunity as well to look at the issue of diversification? And I say that because I wouldn't pretend to be an expert in terms of the exact construct, in terms of the majority of revenues, whether it's from the beach economy, as one would call it, in terms of tourism or other aspects of it. But certainly as Trinidad and Tobago have been having this long-standing conversation about diversification from the oil and gas revenues, which comprise the majority of revenues to the unitary state of Trinidad and Tobago. In terms of Tobago, is this an opportunity for Tobago to look at other areas, as you talked about this issue of more independence in terms of revenue and funding?
Right. So the thing is, one of the suggestions I have, and I hope that it's something that the PDP is willing to look at and try to really focus on for Tobago. Tobago has the mantra clean, green, and serene. And, well, of course, maybe last night they demonstrated one aspect of that, But the point is, where they should be focusing on is renewable energy, sustainable energy. So in other words, Tobago should have wind farms. We have the coastal action of the waters. We can generate energy just from the oceans, just from the fact of you having that constant tidal action. There are so many ways that Tobago can do this. And we ought to be the leaders, we ought to be in charge of that, so that we can now promote ourselves as a zero carbon neutral island. That would be such a benefit to Tobago. There are so many tourists who will just come to Tobago simply if that were the fact. We should therefore be looking at, ensuring that we have zero carbon emission vehicles in Tobago. And that should be our focus in terms of developing our sustainable economy in Tobago. By pushing that aspect, we would get funding from the World Bank, we'd get funding from the IMF, we'd get funding from all these international agencies that promote these things. And we can then now show the world what a small island can do in terms of the effect on climate change and making a positive difference in that regard.
What do you think would be the main priority of the new executive of the Tobago House of Assembly for this term?
Well, from what I've heard from Mr. Augustine and his fellow supporters, it seems that they want to focus on the areas of accountability, transparency, and ensuring that they do have a budget passed, in the sense that Tobago did not really have its budget. Normally they would do that budgetary exercise in June. That was not done this year. So I think these are the things they want to focus on, and they've emphasized the issues of accountability and transparency, because they've been harping very much on the fact of the Auditor General's reports in the past, and the fact that there really appears to have been little attempt at that accountability and transparency from previous THA administration. So it seems that that is going to be one of their main areas of focus as they get in there.
Now, another thing as well, too, I'm wondering about your take in terms of the conversation with regard to, of course, you had the political leader of the PDP, Watson Duke, making his statements about the issue of whether Tobago should be going it alone and so on. And Mr. Fadi Augustine, the deputy political leader of the PDP, saying, well, what they're looking at is something more like a federation type arrangement as what you see with England, Scotland, Ireland, and so on. But in terms of the conversation, because the PNM was very clear that Trinidad and Tobago needs to remain as a unitary state, and I wonder how much of that conversation in Tobago factored into the result we saw last night.
I would think that in some respects it did, because there are lots of Tobagonians who feel very passionately about those issues. So I think that the PDP was able to tap into that sentiment. And I think persons also recognized that what has happened is that there's a tremendous amount of lip service being paid to these ideas in Trinidad, in the central government. Whereas when one party is in power, they speak about it and say, yes, we want to get it done. Then the opposition will oppose because they don't want you to claim the victory for having done it. And then when the roles are reversed and the sides are switched, they flip the script and then they do the opposite. So therefore, it's just a political football that has been played all the time. And I think Tobagonians are beginning to see through that. So I think that also played a part in terms of the sentiment of some persons in the way they voted yesterday.
And we'll continue this discussion in terms of how people are feeling here in Tobago and what would have factored into the result yesterday. We'll take a commercial break and then we'll continue with more from Martin George as we will continue with our morning edition program here from Tobago.
The following is brought to you by Mount Irving Bay Resort.
And good morning again, and thanks for staying with us. For those of you just joining us, this is the TV6 News Morning Edition program here from the Sugar Mill Restaurant from the Mount Irving Bay Resort here in Tobago, and we are continuing our coverage of the day after, the morning after, the Tobago House of Assembly election that saw the PDP winning, and by their tally, 12 of the 15 seats that were contested. Of course, we will see in terms of the EBC's data in that regard. Now, also, we have with us this morning, and just before the commercial break, we had a conversation. We're continuing it now with Martin George as well, present here this morning. And just want to go back to something in terms of the EBC. Now, we have, according to their data, there would have been a total electorate of 51,383 in Tobago yesterday, of which the special electors would have been 932. So that would have been about 50,451 in terms of the electorate at the polls yesterday registered. Do you think that we would have seen something even beyond, let's say, the 60% range in terms of voter turnout? Or because it seems as if there was an increase in voter turnout as opposed to January.
Yes. Yes,
from the preliminary information. Yeah.
I think even the EBC indicated from their early readings of things, in terms of the numbers that they were seeing, they said that if that trend continued, then clearly the numbers would have been higher than January. And what's significant, Jewel, is the fact that when you consider the overall population of Tobago, you recognize that the majority of the population in Tobago is of voting age. So in other words, when they send a signal, such as they sent last night, then clearly that is a signal from the majority of Tobago. been sent. So therefore, it cannot be ignored.
I know we spoke earlier about the impact that this could have in terms of the next general election due in 2025. We're a bit away from that. But in terms of the local government election, has there been any sort of connection between, let's say, a Tobago House of Assembly election result and what would happen in terms of the 14 municipal corporations in a local government election?
There has been, if one looks at it historically, there has been a connection in that the THA really always is the trendsetter in that regard. You would recall that in terms of the local elections, they've changed hands quite a few times, so therefore it's obvious that you can look at the THA elections as a barometer. It doesn't mean necessarily that this is how it has to play out, but certainly it's a warning sign and it tells you the way the wind is blowing. So if you don't adjust your course and make the necessary adjustments, then of course you will suffer the consequences.
Going back to Tobago, the ABC had said on nomination day that there were 45 candidates from 5 political parties that would have contested the election yesterday. The PNM and the PDP each fielded 15 candidates for the 15 electoral districts. The Innovative Democratic Alliance, the IDA, fielded 13 out of the 15 electoral districts. They had 13 candidates, with no candidates vying to contest the electoral districts of Belgarden, Glamorgan, and Roxborough Argyle. The Class Action Reform Movement and the Unity of the People parties each fielded 1 candidate in the electoral district of Bucco Mount Pleasant. Again, reading from the EBC's information here, but also that was the only electoral district that was being contested by 5 candidates, and that there were no independent candidates contesting the election. Now, the idea that started with the issue of 1 candidate feeling as an independent, forming a new party, but we saw the result last night. So what does that say in terms of the issue of the construct of the politics of Tobago, where a third party did not necessarily register in any major way at all as compared to the PNM and the PDP?
Well, the thing is, I think that, clearly the IDA needs to look at their IDEA to start with. They really need to look at the idea of what they are about and where they are going and where they are positioning themselves in the Tobago space. It does not mean that you cannot form a party and get traction on the ground quickly.
The PDP did so in 5 years.
This is my point.
That's what he said last night.
And then not just that, remember Ashworth Jack with the TOP. Basically it's in like about 4 months Ashworth was able to organize himself and he was able to gain some traction.
So it's interesting you mentioned the TOP. So what's the difference, say, between the TOP and what we've seen with the PDP since its formation?
Well, in terms of the TOP, I think one of the things that was their ultimate downfall is that there was a very clear and very flagrant, open association with the UNC party in Trinidad, which I think worked against them and to their detriment, the way it was portrayed to Tobagonians. It doesn't mean that you cannot work along with a party from Trinidad, but I think the way that it occurred with, masses of, supporters flooding Tobago, I think Tobagonians felt a certain sense of unease, almost as if, well, okay, is it an invasion? Is it that people are coming to take over Tobago? And of course, these fears were fueled by the PNM at the time when they, tried to portray it as, well, a UNC takeover. So I think that worked against them there. In this instance, you would notice that the PDP managed that relationship much more carefully in the sense that there was no flooding of Tobago with, either, UNC supporters or anything of the sort, or even their leaders.
But the PNM was consistently saying that the PDP is representative of the UNC and so on.
They were saying so, but the point is, saying it and then seeing the evidence on the ground, of course, those are 2 different things. And I think that's where the TOP really fell into error in terms of their lead up to their elections, where they suffered a resounding loss as a result. So I think that has been much better managed in this instance.
And in your perspective, in terms of the result last night, in the context of the legislation for Tobago self-governance, I recall that Mr. Augustine from the PDP did say that he had wished, in terms of the debates in Parliament, that the opposition in Parliament had a bit more of a conversation with the PDP in terms of the points it would have been making in Parliament. That would have been the opposition. what is your sense of what could happen now in terms of what would be advocated on behalf of Tobago by the PDP?
Well, I mean, I think that certainly both parties, both the PNM and the UNC, are going to be very careful in terms of how they treat with the THA going forward, because they would both recognize, you see, the bigger picture here, Jewel, is not just the THA and the governance of the THA. The bigger picture for the two major political parties, the PNM and the UNC, would be those two Tobago seats, Tobago East and Tobago West. And that's what they would both be looking at. So in other words, they would be thinking of it in terms of what is likely to happen in the event of a general election. So they would both be interested in courting those two seats. The PNM, of course, they would want to court them directly by winning them. The UNC traditionally has not thrown its hat directly into the ring to contest them. But of course, I guess they would be looking at trying to court a relationship with the PDP to ensure that if those two seats are won, that they somehow get them on their side. So that's where the big prize is, because you look at the numbers now, Jewel. If you have a scenario as it is now of, you have basically 22-19, you recognize that two seats, those two seats are what would make the difference. You take away 2 from 22, you end up with 20. That means you've lost the general election. You add those 2 to 19, you end up with 21. That means you've won the general election. So those 2 Tobago seats are going to be the 2 most important seats in any general election going forward from here in terms of the 2025 perspective.
So obviously we're having the conversation about the PDP and what would have led to its victory last night and so on. The PNM says, of course, it will be revisiting its strategies and whatnot. They did, of course, extend congratulations. Democracy is alive and well in Tobago and so on, the positions that were espoused last night by the leadership of the Tobago Council of the PNM. But what would the PNM have to do in Tobago to get back to the place it would have been, let's say, not just in terms of in January, but the elections before? Because at one time, as you had referenced, there was a result where the PNM won all 12 seats in Tobago.
Right. So I think at this point they have a crisis of credibility, and they need to deal with that. So in other words, clearly the players who they have put forth in this election, their shelf life is way past expiry date. So they should not have, most of them should not have been there as frontline candidates in the first place. They have absolutely no credibility left with the Tobago population. So they need to do major house cleaning. Get rid of all those who are spent, who are useless, who are expired, and you need to come with fresh faces, innovative ideas, and you need to build back that trust from the ground up. It is not impossible, but the fact of the matter is there's a whole lot of work that needs to be done to begin to build back that trust. The fact of the matter is, when people talk about the victimization, the stigmatization, the blacklisting, it is a real thing that many Tobagonians have experienced, if not personally, either their relatives, their friends, other family members. They have seen the effects of that. So therefore, when you see people are bitter and they say, listen, I am going to vote against this, that's the effect we saw last night.
And that puts the PDP under a certain amount of pressure to make sure that it meets its promise that they don't do the same thing.
The same trap, of course. They also have now to live up to a higher standard, because they have spoken specifically about that many times. So therefore, it is going to be interesting to see how they navigate those waters. Of course, they've indicated that, once they are successful, it's going to be governance for all Tobagonians, regardless of your party affiliation, etc. So we wait to see how that is played out in actuality.
Mr. Weston actually used those words there, that the PDP has to be held to a higher standard.
Yes,
and so on.
of course. And I am hoping that people do hold them to a higher standard, and I'm hoping that they do live up to it, quite frankly.
What is your take on what would have happened in terms of the additional electoral districts and the reconfiguration in terms of some of the boundaries? How much of an impact would have had? The opposition in the parliament in Port of Spain would have been saying that it gave the PNM an advantage, which certainly didn't see that last night. In fact, one wonders whether the PNM suffered a disadvantage in terms of those additional seats or not.
Right. Well, the thing is, I think the whole idea behind it from the PNM perspective was that they saw it as a bonus, a boon, a benefit for themselves. Because essentially the EBC was hamstrung once you made it from 12 to 15. Where are you going to get the numbers from? It's really from primarily areas which would have been traditionally PNM strongholds. So I think that was the thinking of the PNM's master strategists when they decided, look, let's go to 15. Because I was the first one who said, go to 13. That's all you need. 13 is a prime number, divisible only by itself and 1. So therefore, that's the perfect number to go to.
And the government would say, just to interject, the government would say the EBC, and the EBC would say they are independent. EBC is an independent institution following all of the relevant constitutional arrangements and so on.
Let's get it correct. The number of seats was determined by the government, not by the EBC. The government determined the number of seats by saying, let it go to 15. The EBC then now had to draw the boundaries to make that work. So the EBC was hamstrung in terms of that. So that's why I keep saying we must never attack the EBC in that regard or cast aspersions against the EBC. They had to work with the 15 seats that were handed to them by the parliament. Remember, that went to parliament, they decided it's 15, and I think that's where the PNM thought that they're going to get this advantage. In other words, from 6-6, basically giving themselves 3 additional strongholds seats, so to speak. But it showed last night that the people of Tobago, it didn't matter where you thought were traditional strongholds of the PNM, the people in Tobago, they showed you that, listen, don't get comfortable, don't get cozy, don't take us for granted, don't take our vote for granted, do not think we are fools. So in other words, all the promises, the blandishments, the offerings that the PNM would have been handed out and doling out over these past few weeks, Tobagonians accepted them and they said, okay, thank you. And most of them went and voted against the PNM still.
That issue that you discussed in terms of the configuration, in terms of some of the areas that would have reflected last night in terms of the additional districts. One of the panelists last night was saying was a bit interesting in terms of, let's say, Mr. Ansel Dennis, who had been up to yesterday the incumbent Tobago House of Assembly Chief Secretary and someone who had, of course, been seen as a fairly popular figure, at least at a certain point during the term of the PNM in charge of the THA. But we saw the result yesterday. Is it also reflective of that, or was that also, again, the issue of voters saying they want something new, they want change?
I think it's the second part. I think it's just people were fed up and they wanted change. After 21 years, and I made the point in a Facebook post a few days ago, Jewel. I said, listen, if you can't fix the present, how could you be promising the sun, moon, and stars to fix the future? And I think that's how Tobagonians really viewed it. After 21 years, you cannot now be coming to tell me, oh, well, you now have an idea for development of Scarborough and a new Scarborough port, particularly after that idea has been publicly put out there by the PDP. So Tobagonians, they're not silly. They recognize, wait, so you didn't know about this before? You wait until you see the PDP put out this idea, and then now you come and then, the folly of it to then say, oh, we have $60 million set aside for this. Really? So when was this being done? In secret? That nobody knew? So it makes absolutely no sense. So you saw the desperation in their eyes in terms of the fact that they were clutching at straws and they had absolutely no new ideas to bring to the table. And that's the frightening thing. After 21 years, you've gotten so comfortable, So basically, it's almost like they became a victim of their own success. That they were so, if you think of BlackBerry, the company, with cell phones, they were so successful, they ended up dying because of their own success, because they got so comfortable that they felt, well, there's no competition around, not recognizing that while they were sleeping and relaxing, others were working and toiling in the fields.
And we've seen this before in politics in the past as well, not just in Trinidad and Tobago, but of course in other jurisdictions also.
That's correct, yes.
I'm also wondering now, and again, just revisiting something, because with the PDP and the pronouncements made by the leadership of the PDP, certainly the issue of more autonomy, increased independence, whatever that means for Tobago in terms of be it funding, be it in terms of other governance issues. But what is your take in terms of the issue of whether, because I wonder, for example, someone like yourself who's been very involved in things, Tobago, what is your sense? Is it that it's time for a conversation of Tobago going it alone, or is it the conversation should center around Tobago having more authority over its affairs under the umbrella of the unitary state of Trinidad and Tobago?
Well, I would always advocate the latter, because at the end of the day, we are Trinidad and Tobago. So for me, there's no question of two separate states, you know, a state of Trinidad and a state of Tobago. You know, I think that really and truly we are a unitary state, and while you can give more autonomy and you can give greater freedom and flexibility, it doesn't mean you have to break up the union, so to speak. Nobody wants to have to apply for a passport to be able to go to Trinidad, and vice versa. Nobody wants to have a passport to be able to come to Tobago. So let's be clear on that. I think that what you can do within the framework of what we have existing is you can have that greater autonomy. You can have even the legislative autonomy in terms of you make Tobago laws, basically, which would govern, you know, the issues within Tobago. But then, of course, you would always have the national parliament, which would be responsible for laws for Trinidad and Tobago generally.
And that point includes the issue of the legislation, self-governance for Tobago and whatnot. Do you think that was a factor in terms of this election, the idea that going forward, whoever would be in charge of the THA could have more power potentially once these things are sorted out in the Parliament in Port of Spain, more power than, let's say, any THA executive prior?
Well, I think that's certainly on the minds of many Tobagonians, and it's a very important issue to them. So they see it as something whereby they feel that they have been deprived of their rightful seat at the table, so to speak, and as a result, it's a touchstone and a flashpoint for many of them. So therefore, in that regard, I would like to see how the PDP is going to navigate this scenario going forward, particularly in treating the central government and the demands they make for greater autonomy.
Well, thank you very much. That was Martin George, of course, the president of the Tobago Business Chamber, giving us his perspective in terms of the result that we saw last night in terms of the THA election. We'll take a commercial break and we will return with the rest of our morning edition program here from the Sugar Mill restaurant at the Mount Irving Bay Resort here in Tobago.